All right, welcome everyone. We may have a few people join us more as we get started. This is a web seminar talking, I got to get to the right slide here. I apologize, I'm not in the right place here. All right, here we go again. My name is John Hay. I'm with University of Nebraska Extension. I welcome you to our solar lease considerations for landowner seminar. I see in our attendee list, we have quite a few landowners, some people from government and extension and other places, and all are welcome. We're here to talk about solar leases, particularly from the standpoint of a landowner's point of view. And we are recording this today so that we can share this with others that want to see this in the future. If you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. We'll get to those questions periodically throughout the web seminar today. Our general agenda today is to talk about overall kind of trends, both nationally and locally. I'm going to talk a little bit about solar policy and solar development in Nebraska to this point and looking into the future a little bit. We're going to look a little bit about utility scale PV solar and construction, kind of that construction phase. What do these systems look like a little bit? And then we're going to talk about solar lease agreements and get into a little bit more on the legal side of it, which is a really important piece. And that's going to take actually quite a bit of the time today is that last part. We are basing a lot of this information on a publication put out by Ohio State University and written by two of our speakers today, Farm Landowner's Guide to Solar Leasing, and Peggy's going to talk about that more. We have three of us that are going to be presenting today. Again, my name is John Hay. I'm an extension educator and I focus on energy issues here at the University of Nebraska. We have Eric Romick from Ohio State. He is kind of a counterpart of mine in Ohio and does a lot of statewide work with respect to energy. And then we have Peggy Hall, who is a field specialist in ag resource law there at Ohio State, and she's going to be talking about some of the legal elements that for our presentation today. So welcome everyone. Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you for the first part of our presentation.
Great, John, thanks. Get control of the screen here. All right, so thanks again, John, for having us, and looking forward to the workshop this afternoon. This is a topic that we've really been dealing with here in Ohio pretty intensely over the last couple of years, and so certainly as more and more needs popped up and projects, Peggy and I started to collaborate on putting some resources together, and so welcome the opportunity to work with you, John, and help those there in Nebraska. So looking at utility scale trends from the national level, I just want to take a couple slides to look at some of the trends and maybe trying to answer the question, why is this stuff happening? So why are we seeing development at this scale, and where is this type of development taking place? And so this is kind of that 30,000 foot view as we look at utility scale generation capacity additions by year. And as you can see, it's color coded. And, to me, this chart really kind of speaks to the energy mix, within a region, within the US. And Daniel Yergin's an excellent energy author, always talks about the energy mix within a region is determined by resource availability, technology, economics, and the 3 Ps: policy, politics, and public opinion. And I think you can look at this chart and see evidence of that, as far back as 1930. John, can you see my cursor? I'm just curious.
No, I can't.
Okay. No sense in me moving it then. So, you think about 1930 and the spike in hydroelectric, and obviously, that could be related to a policy driver where we had a lot of development in the Tennessee Valley Authority, as we started to kind of look at that economic stimulus package to bring on a lot of hydroelectric. You can look into like the 2005 through 2018, you see a lot of green there. A lot of wind was brought online. And if you look at that, it really overlaps with the production tax credit program. And so, you can see evidence of how this is moving forward. What we're really focused on today is that sliver of yellow that started to pop up shortly after 2010, and that is utility scale solar development. And so this next slide, we're going to look at that little yellow section in a little more detail. So this is a chart that's kind of marking out the annual utility scale capacity additions by region. So you can see it's color coded there. Obviously, a lot of solar capacity in California, in the Southwest, and through the South Atlantic. And again, a lot of that is due to resource availability. Some of it's due to policy drivers. North Carolina, for example, has some rather attractive state investment tax credit programs that, when you partner with the federal programs, makes solar rather attractive in that region. And you can see Ohio and Nebraska kind of fall in that gray category of all other that we're starting to see some additional development with. So a lot of times I'll get a question related to 2016 where you can see, there was 8 gigawatts of capacity brought online. And the question is, why such a spike and then a dramatic drop off? And what was happening there was in 2016, the 30% federal investment tax credit program was scheduled to expire at the end of the year. And ultimately, there was kind of this rush to the finish line mentality where people were trying to get projects in before that program went away. It was ultimately extended through 2019, and there's a schedule working beyond that we'll look at in a second. But that was one of the reasons for that spike. And then you can see we've been pretty steady at 5 gigawatts of capacity additions each year thereafter. So I mentioned the investment tax credit program. I just kind of want to take a second to look at this because it is relevant as we think about A, it's a driving force for development, and B, there's a timeline that's fairly critical as we look at this moving forward. So the federal investment tax credit program's a dollar for dollar tax credit against federal income tax liability for eligible project expenses. And you can see the timeline where it was extended from 2016 at 30% through the end of 2019. And then what happens is we start to have kind of this scale down where each year it steps down. You can see 4%. So it's at 26% through the end of 2020. It'll drop another 4 points next year and be locked in at 22% through the end of 2021. And then ultimately, following 2021, for commercial projects, it'll get locked in at 10% indefinitely. For residential systems, just as a side note, that after 2021, that'll expire altogether. So again, this is just one of the driving forces. A lot of times the question is, gee, why is this so fast and furious right now? Well, you can kind of see the timeline where if you're going to build a project, there's a lot of benefit to getting it done sooner rather than later at this point. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about some cost trends related to PV solar because I mentioned one of the drivers is the investment tax credit program. Another drivers, quite honestly, is just the reduction that we've seen in installation cost. Before I share the cost data with you, though, I did want to kind of briefly look at 2 different technologies. What you see on the left is what's referred to as a fixed tilt system or a fixed tilt array. And it's just that. I mean, it's a racking system that has a predetermined tilt angle, and it's locked in at that angle, and it sits there and generates electricity and doesn't move. As a general guideline, if you want to create the most electricity over the course of the year, your tilt angle is going to be facing due south oriented due south at a tilt similar to your latitude. What you see on the right is a technology that we're seeing a lot more of here in Ohio, and that is a single axis tracking system that's going to track the sun from east to west throughout the day. And historically we saw mostly fixed tilt systems, but most of the projects that are under review right now are single axis trackers. And that's for 2 reasons. A, you can get significantly more production. So system I modeled in central Ohio, you basically saw an increase in production of about 22% between a fixed tilt and a single axis tracker. And the other reason is the cost gap between the two technologies has really closed. Okay. So here in the chart, you can kind of see, where those cost trends have gone. And we've basically seen a, 77 to an 80% reduction for both technologies from 2010 to 2018. But, as you can see in 2010, there's a little bit more of a gap between the two types of systems. Whereas in 2018, it's really closed up to where they're pretty price compatible, or comparable, I should say. And again, you're going to get significantly more production from a single axis tracker system. I always like to note these prices, these benchmark costs come from an annual report, or actually a quarterly report from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And I have found their data to be extremely accurate. I work a lot more with commercial systems than I do the utility projects, but I've seen examples where, they're within pennies of real projects that I'm seeing built. And so I do have a lot of faith in these numbers. And these numbers represent kind of a flip the switch perspective. So this is an all-in cost per DC watt. And so these costs are representing, the sales price that you're going to pay to a developer or an installer for this system. So it has all of the equipment, equipment profit and overhead and interconnection and engineering and permitting. All of these costs are kind of included with this number. So one of the main drivers as we look at what has brought the cost down so much in the last decade, and a big driver is the module trends. And so if you look at the cost of PV solar modules, you can see we've seen about a 78% decrease from $2.12 in 2010 to 47 cents per DC watt in 2018. If you break out the total installed cost, so if we're looking at a fixed tilt system in 2018, we said that was $1.06 per DC watt. What this is saying is 47 cents of that $1.18 was allocated towards purchasing the modules. And you can see the pie chart there kind of shows the BOSS, the balance of systems is what that abbreviation stands for. Module, inverters, soft cost, labor. So over 44%, or right around 44% of the total cost is just for the modules themselves. And interestingly enough, if you look back to 2010, where our module costs are at $2.12, if you think back to what the total installation cost was in 2010, it was $4.63 per DC watt. So we're 45% of the total installed cost was for modules. So that number's remained relatively consistent, even though the cost of the modules has come down. Final chart here before we kind of transition into some more regional stuff is utility scale PV generation units. And this is a screenshot from the US Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration. And it's basically pin marking all of the utility scale units across the country. And this includes any generator that is over 1 megawatt. And I should say solar generators. So this is only solar facilities over 1 megawatt. And combined, if you look at kind of the total, the total installation capacity in the U.S., we're at 62.5 gigawatts in 2019, and it's important to recognize though that that's a capacity number, right? So that's looking at these facilities in terms of what their maximum potential output would be. And I showed the chart there in the bottom right that also provides the capacity factor, because I think it's an important thing to remember as we're talking about utility scale electric generators. Is 100 megawatt solar facility is not likely to generate 100 megawatts of electricity all the time. And so a capacity factor is simply a ratio of what is the actual energy output versus the maximum potential output. And so as we look at utility scale capacity factors, we're around 24%. If you look at all solar technologies, so that would include rooftop systems, your behind the meter type stuff that's on businesses and homes, as well as utility scale. The national capacity factor average is around 18% for solar. So, and if you look at the total solar installation and the net electrical generation in 2019 was right around 104,000 gigawatt hours. That's about 2.5% of the net electrical generation for the country. So kind of give you a perspective of where solar fits within our energy mix. So with that, I will give controls back to John to talk about some regional electricity and development.
Thank you, Eric. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of regional electricity development, kind of trying to build a little bit of a big picture look about electricity in the Nebraska and in the region, and trying to build up kind of a foundation to help us understand solar development a little bit. First of all, Nebraska in more recent years, maybe the last 10 years, has become a member of the Southwest Power Pool. And that is a regional transmission organization that helps regulate and maintain the stability of the electric grid and the dispatch of resources, trying to keep prices down and reliability up. And we used to do a lot of that regulation ourselves locally within the state. Now it's happening on a more regional basis as we become a member. I actually downloaded this picture of the Southwest Power Pool map region just this morning, and this is actually a price, real-time price of electricity at that moment in time. And the price of electricity is very low because blue is a very low price, somewhere around 0 to 1 cent per kilowatt hour. And actually that little purple spot is a negative electricity price, which is a interesting phenomena that can take place because of subsidized wind power. I also looked at the PJM interconnection prices today, Eric, which is where Eric's world is, and their prices were in a very similar range. Very low prices happen in the spring and the fall of the year. They happen all year, but when demand is down because we're not running our air conditioners very much, we're not running our heating very much, and wind power can be up, then the prices can go down quite dramatically. Not everyone is involved with regional transmission organizations, but they are fairly common across the United States of America. Ours just so happened to be the Southwest Power Pool. I want to just give a little bit of a background. Eric had some numbers with respect to capacity and energy and the capacity factors. Those capacity factors play into what I'm going to talk about here. This is just some general information about the Southwest Power Pool and its kind of basic facts about it. And I want to maybe call your attention maybe more to the two charts. The capacity of generation in the Southwest Power Pool as of right now is predominantly natural gas, coal, and wind in that order, with nuclear, with hydro and nuclear being the fourth and fifth. Solar comes into that, but it really doesn't show up on this map because it's so small on the pie chart. But when we actually look at energy generation, what is running and what percentage of the time it runs, most of our electricity comes from coal. Wind is second, natural gas is third. So our capacity for natural gas is very high, but our actual use of it is lower because the natural gas is used for peaking purposes to run when we have very high load, and also to follow the wind. So if it's a windy day, there's less natural gas running. If it's a very calm day, there's more natural gas running. So our total generation is dominated by coal, wind, natural gas, and nuclear being the fourth. The fact that nuclear comes in fourth for total generation annually is impressive in that footprint because there's only 2 nuclear power plants in that footprint. But generally, when they run full capacity 24 hours a day, essentially. Right now, one of those is on a refueling outage. So if we look at the nuclear today, it's from just 1 power plant. when we look at the interconnection requests, when a system wants to put electricity onto the grid, it needs to request interconnection to the electric grid with the Southwest Power Pool. And so when we look at interconnection requests across a period of time, we're seeing what potential generation is going on to the grid in new generation. So we're not looking at old generation that's already on, has permission to be on the grid. We're looking at those new connections. And when we look across the last 19 years, new connections requests have been dominated by the renewables, particularly wind and solar. And you can see that across all the states that have at least portion of their land in the Southwest Power Pool. Nebraska is one of those with a large number of wind and a large number of solar. The solar is even more interesting in the fact that really those solar interconnection agreements have really been only in the last couple of years. And a lot of there wasn't much for solar requests prior to a couple of years ago. So they've been very new in that. One of the things that impressed me when I downloaded this data was the sheer number of battery interconnection requests for battery storage. The total number of gigawatts or megawatts in this case on the y-axis isn't real high for batteries, but the total number of requests was fairly high. So lots of battery projects are being proposed out there. And I know that one of those is getting built near Norfolk, Nebraska, starting next year. But that was impressive to me. The other in this case is, I think in Nebraska, that other is a nuclear, not a new nuclear power plant, but an expanded generation capacity of our existing nuclear power plants. And I think that's what that interconnection agreement was. Not all of these have been built, and not all of these will be built. This is just a kind of a picture across time of what requests are coming in. One of the things that is happening more is who is buying this solar generation, and what we're seeing is a trend for more solar generation being bought by corporate entities. If we look in the past 10 years or 20 years, the wind power in Nebraska has been purchased predominantly by our public utilities and our utilities within the state. But it's happening with wind, where some of that generation is being purchased by corporate entities through contracts. And two examples from the state of Nebraska with wind power. One is Facebook out of south of Omaha purchased the output from the wind farm north of Wakefield, and they worked through OPPD to get that contract done. But that is an actual contract between Facebook and the wind farm. And so that's a corporate entity driving some of that demand for renewables. Smucker's, the company that makes jams and jellies, bought some of the output from the other wind farm in Wayne County. And so again, they're doing that through some type of a contractual issue, either a virtual PPA or a green tariff, which are different ways of contracting for that power. A virtual PPA might be a direct contract, versus a green tariff might be a company working through a utility. And so they say, I want my power to be from green power from Lincoln Electric System, for example, here in Lincoln. And Lincoln Electric System then contracts with a solar farm or a wind farm to provide that green power. So different ways to contract that, but that is increasingly happening across the United States. And it is also happening here in Nebraska. And so as we look at some of these potential solar farms that are being proposed, the buyers of those, the potential buyers for those have expanded beyond just public utilities and private utilities into some of these corporate entities. Let's talk about policy a little bit in Nebraska. I just want to give some background. Most people might understand this. If you don't, I just think it's worthwhile to talk about. Nebraska is a public power state. And what does that mean? It means some fairly basic things, which is that all of the utilities in the state of Nebraska are publicly owned or consumer-owned utilities. Public power exists in all of the states, but Nebraska is the only one where it is a statute where we're all public power. And so that's what that means. It means that they have a statute that says to provide low-cost, reliable electricity without competition and exclusive service areas. And those are the main three bullets I wanted to touch on of what's happening in Nebraska with electricity. Has to be all kind of understood within the reality that we're a public power state and we have to work within this set of statutes. Generally, generation has to go to the Power Review Board. The statutes don't really contemplate export, and so that some of those rules had to get dealt with, and with newer laws to try to clarify that. And then the rates are governed by different governing bodies. So just a little primer on public power in Nebraska. Eric talked about one of the drivers of solar being policy and tax credits. And then I talked about a driver of corporate entities wanting to be more green. Another driver that does take place across the United States is renewable portfolio standards, where the state makes a law that suggests that a certain amount of the electricity be from renewable sources. Nebraska does not have a renewable portfolio standard. Some of our utilities do have voluntary goals. Those utilities that have set voluntary goals in the past have exceeded those goals because they've adopted a lot of low-cost wind power in recent years. But we don't have that driver. That doesn't necessarily hurt us. It just doesn't add that an additional level of policy that requires more renewable development. And so I don't foresee Nebraska adopting a standard in the near future, but those are always options out there for the legislature to do. Okay, so the real question is, if we have a public power state, how do we develop renewables in that public power state? And the reason that this is important is that public utilities don't pay taxes as taxes. They do have some in lieu of tax payments, but they do not pay taxes. And so if the subsidy at the federal level is a tax credit, they can't access that tax credit. So how do we allow for those low-cost renewables that get the tax credit in a public power state? Well, let's look back in history a little bit. There was only two ways to do it prior to 2007. The public utility builds it, or the native tribe or nation build it. And we did see some examples of wind farms being built by public utilities. Lincoln, OPPD, the NPPD at Ainsworth, and then the wind farm at Kimball all got built by public utilities, essentially without subsidy by the federal government. But as the wind industry started to boom, Nebraska wanted to take advantage of that and get some of that economic development, so they started to pass laws. And they really passed these laws with wind in mind, but over the intervening years, solar and other renewables have become part of this set of laws. So how do we allow for private development of renewables in a public power state? First of all, it can be community-based energy development, which is a law that says if there's Nebraska ownership in that renewable development, it can get built in a public power state. The private developer can do it if they sell that power to a public utility. It was a law passed in 2009. And a number of wind farms got developed under that, where the public utilities were buying that electricity. Then there was a law about private developer can build it for export. And that was a really overarching, very sweeping law. I'm going to cover that a little bit more detail in the next slide because it's an important law. But started to allow for a developer not only to sell to a public utility, but sell to some of those other entities that we talked about, other utilities in other states, as well as potential some of those private companies. There is some other legislation that cleared up some language, added some other incentives. One of those was in 2013. They passed essentially a sales tax credit for large renewable developments, and also put in there some provisions about they get some of those tax credits if they use Nebraska businesses and services. Some other ones here. I got to move this so I can see my whole screen. Sorry. But some other changes in 2016, they were able to allow renewable sales without a long-term contract. Prior to 2016, the renewable had to have a power purchase agreement, a long-term contract to be able to build in Nebraska. Now they're allowing them to play more on that spot market if they want to take that risk. And then this most recent change has to do with eminent domain, and I'll cover that in another slide. Really quick primer overview of LB 1048. Really was written with wind in mind, but renewables have become part of that rule. Well, they allowed for out-of-state electricity sales. They also changed the way renewable projects were taxed, which is really an important consideration. And I think I have the taxing on a taxing slide in a minute, so I'll explain that in more detail. It also added decommissioning, a requirement to put a decommissioning security in place after 10 years, which is some protection, at least for the landowner and the community, to ensure that there's money to take that system down after it's at least after it's over 10 years old. It did also, LB 1048 also provided a way for public power or a public utility to eminent domain land for transmission to service the private wind facility, or in this case, renewable facility. They said that transmission is a public use, even if it's to serve a private utility. And then they also added painting and lighting of met towers. Now, I told you a second ago that LB 155 last year added two words to that law, rebuttable presumption. And they said that the fact that that is a public use is a rebuttable presumption, which allows the landowners who might get eminent domain at least some ability to fight that in court to rebut that is a public use. So they didn't have that before, and they put that in place. Again, some of the tax incentives, they qualify for if they get a sales tax refund for the qualified property that they pay taxes on, but they have to be big projects and maintain the employees. So that is a incentive that the state has put in place for large renewable projects, of which a lot of these utility scale solar projects we're talking about would fit in this over $20 million range. So they would qualify for this. LB 824 allowed for renewables to sell without a long-term contract. In some ways, it allows those to kind of play in the risky electricity marketplace. We have seen one wind farm get built in this way. It also exempted the renewable projects from going to the Power Review Board once they met certain requirements. So they had to meet certain requirements, but once they met those requirements, they exempted them from having to get approved by the Power Review Board. Let's talk just a bit about taxation. Prior to 2010, prior to LB 1048, all renewable systems paid a depreciable personal property tax on the cost of their systems, on the value of their systems. And so what would happen is they would pay very high tax bills for a very short amount of time, as long as it took them to depreciate those assets. And what that did is it added a lot of money into the tax rolls in the county, but after 5 years, maybe no more taxes into that county. And that was a challenge for the county to deal with that influx. Yeah, it's great to have the influx, but it's challenging to have an influx and then have it be gone. So essentially, LB 1048 removed the personal property tax, said they don't have to pay personal property tax, but will replace it with a nameplate capacity tax that they pay every year that they operate. So instead of paying for 5 years, they pay a smaller tax rate, but for 20 years, 40 years, however long they operate. They do still pay some real property tax based on the other real property that they own. So if they have a maintenance shed that they own, they may pay some real property tax on that. So that was an important change in the way things are taxed, but it also helps us be able to estimate much more clearly how much is going to come into a county in the taxes based on the law. So we don't have to worry about that depreciation. We just have this basically nameplate tax that we are guaranteed to get. Development in Nebraska so far up to 2020, we have seen utility scale solar projects kind of go in a little bit in fits and spurts, where we see a few projects go in 2016 and 17, not very many in 2018, and a couple more in 2019 and 20. And we can name some of those. The big solar farm just west of Lincoln was put in 2017, and that's one of those in the big blue bar. We're also seeing some of the non-residential or the commercial systems going in yellow. But when we really look at this, the total number of these projects in megawatts is only 15 to 20 megawatts a year at the most, for a total of about 61 megawatts in Nebraska installed as of today. If even a single one of these large utility projects that are being proposed, this number is going to skyrocket instantaneously into the thousands of megawatts very quickly. So, or hundreds of megawatts in possibly thousands of megawatts very quickly. Let's look at where these are spread out just a little bit. In the red and the pink are completed utility scale solar projects, some built by private companies, some built by private companies for municipalities. And so there are some different ways these are built and reasons that they're built. Some are meant to serve particular cities. Others are meant more as kind of an overarching one built for the utility grid. So the green are committed projects, ones that haven't been built yet but are likely to get built. And then the blue are under development projects, which are some of the larger projects being proposed. This isn't an exhaustive list. This is a list I got from the Nebraska Energy Office, and if there's something missing in this, don't fret. It's just that some of these numbers aren't always kept up to date to an individual date. So, but generally, you can see that these projects are where there's a population of people and where there's a load. When we look at the less populated areas of the state, we're not seeing these developments. Well, that makes sense. There's not as much need for electricity, so there's going to be fewer projects. Let's just look at the solar potential across the state. Nebraska has decent solar potential. Obviously, as you move to the Southwest United States, there's a lot more sun, but in Nebraska, it does trend from northeast to southwest, where we get a little bit more sun in the southwest. So if we look at those numbers, there's about 4.9 kilowatt hours of energy per square meter per day in the northeast, and that goes to up to 6 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day. That's not how much electricity can be produced. That's how much sunlight energy falls on the Earth's surface per square meter per day. But when we look at that trend across, we see about 13% more sunlight in the southwest Nebraska than in the northeast. And if we put a solar panel up that's going to take that sunlight in and turn it into electricity, we're going to see a similar trend in production. We're going to see slightly more production in the southwest than the southwest than the northeast. We also, when we looked at where those are being built, where the transmission lines are and where they get built does make a big difference, right? If there's transmission to be able to put that electricity onto the grid, that allows it to be able to move to the areas where it's being used. And we're going to see the development that follows that transmission, at least at some level. It may not have to be right on top of that transmission, but it does have to be in the general area where there's transmission. And so we're not likely going to see a lot of solar development in the Sandhills because there's not a lot of transmission there, at least for large scale solar development in the near term. This slide is really why we're here today in many ways, and that is that we talked earlier about those interconnection requests to the Southwest Power Pool for solar. Well, here's a list of those interconnection requests as of a few weeks ago when I downloaded this data. And you can see that there is 5,173 megawatts of interconnection requests out there. And that is, if all of those got built, that's 40,000 acres in Nebraska covered in solar panels. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of these are going to get built. I am suggesting, though, that these are potential projects in Nebraska, some of which already have land leased, some of which are in the process of requesting those land leases, where they have gone to the step of putting that interconnection request in, making sure they have access to the transmission grid potentially as they're working on those land leases. So this list is likely going to continue to expand, but there is a lot of acres here in this. And so an example, I'll just throw out an example that I'm familiar with. This one in Lancaster County, the third one down, 228 megawatts of capacity, proposed interconnection, they have leased approximately 1,000 acres of land just to the east of Lincoln. So 200 megawatts is approximately 1,000 acres, and that's where I move that down and start to see that 40,000 acres. So again, if we look at this, if this actually comes to happen, we're going to see that number rise very, very rapidly, because just a single one of those projects will put this chart off of the screen really quick. So this is likely going to happen. We're going to see that spike, but which of those projects is going to get built and in what time frame, I don't know. Let's talk a little bit about siting. Who has the authority to approve these projects? In Nebraska, the county has a lot of that power. And counties can put together and control the zoning within their counties, and many counties in Nebraska are zoned. And that county planning commission that deals with the zoning is the one that's going to be able to approve or disapprove that particular project in that county based on the rules that they have in place. Municipalities sometimes have that authority based on their extraterritorial authority. So for example, the solar farm proposed east of Lincoln is not inside the city limits of Lincoln, but it is inside their extraterritorial authority. And so the city actually had to approve that that system because it was within their authority area. So it's not in the city, but it was within their boundaries of authority. We talked a little bit about the Power Review Board earlier, and this is just a slide to touch on what is the Power Review Board. The Power Review Board deals with the wholesale service area agreements within the state. They approve construction of new electric generation, and they can deal with disputes. But it's that middle bullet, they approve construction of new electric generation, that I think is important, because I told you that some of these solar projects are exempt from going to the Power Review Board. But I wanted to kind of explain what that meant by exempt. So I wanted to give you an overview of the Power Review Board. For them to meet that exception or to be exempt, prior to construction, they have to be in communication with the Power Review Board and give their intent of what they're going to do. They have to certify that the project meets the requirements that are laid out by the Power Review Board. They have to have a decommissioning plan given to the Power Review Board, and to prove that they have a plan and they have a plan for that decommissioning security that's supposed to be put in place in year 10. They have to certify that they have a transmission agreement, in this case with the Southwest Power Pool. They have to certify that they've consulted with the game and parks and dealt with that if the game and parks had an issue with their location, et cetera. So once they meet these requirements, then they don't have to go to the Power Review Board. If they don't, I suppose they would have to go to the Power Review Board to get approval, which they may not get if they don't meet those requirements. To touch a little bit more detail on decommissioning, at least in Nebraska, decommissioning, just the definition is at the top, withdrawing from service and maybe the remediation of the land after the life of the project. To meet that statute, to not go to the Power Review Board, they have to submit the decommissioning plan, obligating the private electric supplier to bear all the costs of decommissioning. They have to post a security bond or other financial instrument no later than the 10th year. And then they have to comply with requirements adopted by the local government and government entity. So the local zoning may have additional requirements above and beyond what the state puts in place. I'm not going to touch on all these questions, but I just brainstormed a list of questions that you might have or others might have about utility scale solar, and decommissioning is one of them. I touched on that a little bit already. Peggy might touch on that in hers as well. Weeds is a question that I have been thinking about and would like to see clarified, and who controls the weeds in and around the system, and making sure that that's clarified, because I think weed control could become an issue. Chemical application, I don't necessarily foresee this as an issue, just one of the things I was thinking about with respect to, are there any restrictions or rules regarding spraying around these solar farms? And these are just some things that if I was a landowner would want to clarify, what do I have to live up to? Glare and reflection have been a question that I don't think is a very large issue. I think there's a fear that we have this glass covered solar panel or module. A solar panel is a solar module, that we might get a reflection off of it, but really these are designed to absorb light, not to reflect it. So they don't really have a lot of glare. And I think one of the kind of proofs that this isn't too big of an issue is the fact that they built that solar farm west of Lincoln within sight of the interstate. And they really I've heard anybody complain that gave off a glare that caused any of the drivers problems. And I think that they did some research on that prior to that to make sure that wasn't going to be a problem. Hazardous materials, I have a couple of slides on that. Fire, I have a slide on that. And then the contractor related questions, I'm going to turn that over to Peggy in a little bit to talk about those. Just wanted to touch on hazardous materials to make sure that we're clear on kind of what goes into making these systems. The non-panel or non-module parts are generally steel and aluminum and wiring. And so we can imagine these things are not probably an issue, and very highly recyclable when it comes to steel and aluminum, and wiring as well if it's copper or aluminum. So very recyclable, not really a hazardous issue. The solar panels themselves are made of glass, plastic, aluminum, copper, and whatever semiconductor materials, which in a silicon solar cell, that is a silicon crystal, which silicon is sand. It's melted sand. There are small amounts of lead, and so the lead would be the one material that we would worry about. And it is an issue, except for there's not a lot of it. And so the solar panels do meet the EPA's definition for not being toxic leaching potential. And so they are not considered hazardous waste, and they can be landfilled. And so solar panels, whether they're recycled or not, they do meet the requirement of not being toxic according to the EPA, and can be landfilled. Of all of the things I listed, I didn't list very many things that were flammable, and that does reduce the risk of fire in these. Really, probably the small amount of plastic covering the wires is really one of the only flammable pieces of these systems. So they don't have a lot of fire risk because there's not a lot of flammable components. The crystalline silicon panels, are the most common silicon panel that's out there. And again, mostly tempered glass, aluminum, and a little bit of lead. And so really not a big issue, just some, there's really about 1.6 to 24 grams of lead solder in these solar panels each, which is a fairly small amount. So there's a lot more lead than that we carry around in our car batteries every day. So we have lead around us all the time. This is glass encapsulated lead, doesn't pose us much risk, but important to understand that it's there. Cadmium telluride is another common solar panel semiconductor material, and cadmium does have is a toxic heavy metal, but cadmium telluride, which is the particular molecule used in these, has much lower toxicity than cadmium, and thus is not a very big issue. So although the word cadmium is in it, the actual molecule of cadmium telluride has low toxicity, so really not much of an issue. The last thing I'll touch on is electromagnetic fields. And electromagnetic fields can be an issue if they're powerful enough. The electromagnetic fields given off by these solar panels are very low frequency and really don't cause us much risk. So really, they're very low on the electromagnetic field spectrum, so not really an issue. So I'm not saying that there is this is nothing, there's no issues with solar at all. I'm just suggesting that from a health and safety standpoint, the materials used and what's given off by these are pretty safe. The last slide I'm going to touch on before going to questions is just about what is under the solar. And I think that what is under the solar, what vegetation is under a solar panel is an important consideration when it comes to thinking about these in the long term. Because obviously what we don't want is to cause problems with respect to water quality or other things like that. And so there's a lot of talk of planting pollinators or other things under these, but the reality is up to this point, what's been put under these solar panels is grasses that get mowed or weeds that grow up and get mowed. And so any planning that a solar farm has to do maintenance of vegetation is going to be time well spent to thinking about what can we grow under there that looks okay, doesn't cause us problems from a weed standpoint or a shade standpoint, may have other benefits to the land itself. Because remember that as a landowner, these solar panels might be there for 20 to 40 years, but if and when those solar panels come off, we want that land to be back in condition for us to use for some other use, and not having a weed bank, having been under perennial vegetation for that time is going to be good for that land. So just some things to consider as we move forward. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Eric just for a moment, and he's going to talk about construction. He had some experience with construction of a system in his home county a few years ago, and he has a few pictures to share with us about that.
Thanks, John. And we can move through these relatively quickly here to get some questions. But I do think that it's helpful. And I always look at this from with landowners I've worked with here in Ohio. A lot of times they're curious what to expect. If I lease 500 acres or more, what can I expect to happen on my farm? And so I think that these pictures maybe help visualize a little bit more what happens during the construction process. A lot of times we'll see pictures of a completed project with green grass, blue sky, blooming flowers, but for the first 12 to 18 months, it's really going to be a pretty intensive construction site. And so this, I think, will help you maybe visualize that a little bit. So you can see here kind of on day one, equipment shows up on site. In this instance, they had to take the corn off on the west side of the airport. a little bit early. And then, day one, they're going around with the equipment. You can see the four-wheeler there, and um, the track hoe where they're putting in the silt fence to make sure that any disturbed land during the construction phase is sufficiently held on site. The the next thing that you really start to see is some of the site grading. And for the most part, most of the site is not necessarily graded. So when you look at the within the alleyways and look at the solar panels themselves, the racking system, it pretty much follows the natural contour of the land, which was relatively flat. We had slopes of less than, I think, 2-3%. So there's not a lot of grading, but with that said, there's certainly some. And so there's rather extensive access roads that were cut in. There's a laydown yard where their field operations are housed, parking for employees, equipment storage. And then when you think about the amount of modules and racking and all of that stuff that comes in, kind of a shipping receiving area. Here's just kind of another picture where you can see the access road being made. They're hauling in a lot of stone. On the left, there's one of the laydown yard that they're working on. And so again, bringing that stone in, you can see a trench that's following the one access road. That laydown yard, once the construction was complete, that stone was removed and they seeded that area. There were no modules there, but it was kind of returned to a vegetative state, I guess, once the construction phase was done. Here you can see one of the flatbeds that's being offloaded. This was a project that was an 85-acre site, and on that 85 acres there was 159,200 modules. Granted, it's a very different technology than what we're seeing in a lot of projects today. Those modules were actually thin film panels that were, I believe, 75 to 100 watt panels. So this was, again, it's dated a bit now. This is 10 years ago. So one of the reasons that we use those modules, though, is they're actually manufactured just up the road in Perrysburg, Ohio. So a little bit of a side note, but the post that you see there on that 85-acre site, there were 14,600 posts. So again, a lot of these projects we're talking about today are 1,000 to 4,000 acre sites. So think about how many posts are going to be put in the ground. Here you can see some of the trenching that's taking place. So a lot of conduit, a lot of trenching. Here in Ohio, a big thing is to consider, our subsurface infrastructure and assets. Ohio ranks #1 in terms of drainage infrastructure as a percent of cropland. Over 7 million acres of tiled field here. So, that's a big deal. And I'm not sure, John can speak a little bit to how that impacts Nebraska, but just in general, think about subsurface infrastructure as you think about the amount of trenching and posts that are going to be driven into the ground. In general, the most of the decommissioning plans that I've come across here in Ohio, they read to where they plan to leave the cable. So you'll see where they basically say that the collectors are buried typically between 3 and 4 feet, and that they're not going to be removed during the decommissioning process. So that's something to consider. This is just kind of an image of, there is external fencing that shows up on site. And then we had two retention ponds that were constructed that were primarily there for the construction phase to make sure that we retained water, during any precipitation that took place. And so those remained there following construction, but the primary purpose there was to make sure that they're monitoring the flow of surface water during the construction phase. Here you can see the racking that's kind of going in place, and think about again the scope and size of the projects that John was showing you that are being proposed in Nebraska, and many of those are the same sizes that we're seeing here. So we're looking at 1,000 to 4,000 acre sites. And again, we had 14,600 posts on 85 acres. So it gives you a sense of, the amount of materials that are going to need to be brought in to build this project. And the one thing I always remind people is, if you have to bring that many trucks in to haul that steel in, well, when it comes time to take it down, you're going to need a lot of trucks to get all that equipment off site as well. And so, think of this not only through the lens of the construction phase, but what's going to have to happen during the deconstruction or decommissioning, I should say, as well. Most of those posts are simply driven into the ground with a hydraulic ram. I've seen some that are as low as 6, but most of them are kind of between 6 and 8 feet. And finally, you can see, of course, someone has to go through and wire all of those modules. So you see the wires hanging down there in the bottom left. But essentially, the panels are set and clipped, and then crews follow in and do the wiring. You can see that there's certainly some ruts and some compaction taking place in the alleyway there. It's not the best picture with the shading, but again, these are projects that if just because it's wet doesn't mean they're going to stop working. And so we need to kind of consider that as you're working through your agreements, especially as you visualize decommissioning. I advanced that slide a little too quickly. So the last thing on the top right there, you can see they're setting a power enclosure. And so that's really where the only concrete on this site was used. So there were 8 pads that were set in place for these power enclosures. Basically, that's where our switch gears, inverters, step-up transformers are all kind of built into those units, brought in and set with a crane. And so there was a little bit of concrete that was used for those 8 power enclosures on the site. And then finally, this is the picture I think most of us are familiar with, right? A completed project, blue sky, vegetation underneath, but is this project finished? That's kind of a loaded question, right? Because you could look at it as completed, but you could also look at it and say, we're really at the halfway point. It's going to generate electricity for a long period of time, and then we need to go through this process again, just in reverse. And so once again, try and think of these pictures and visualize the work that needs to be done to build, and then also to take them down is in the decommissioning. And really use this to maybe help you as you evaluate the decommissioning part of your agreements. So with that, John, I'll give you control, and we can go ahead and take some questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Eric. Please, if you have questions, go ahead and type those into the chat box. One question that came in, and Eric, maybe you and I can try to tackle this, is the difference in maybe weather risk between a fixed tilt system and a tracking, single axis tracking system. Can you think of any additional weather risk between those two, or any differences from the weather standpoint?
I haven't actually done a lot of research in this area, but I have come across a study. It was an NREL paper that was looking at the ability for single axis trackers to actually, adjust the tilt during extreme wind events to stabilize the modules and the racking system. And it's kind of what they were suggesting, maybe counterintuitive. You would think if you go, flat at a 0-degree tilt, you would have less wind load. And the point there was, with you would actually have a higher orientation of that angle, say a 20 to 30 degree tilt. So while you were increasing the static pressure from the wind, it was stabilizing the rack, because there wasn't that wind shear kind of on the top and the bottom causing that vibration. So they were actually suggesting fixed tilt systems in a high extreme wind event, you could orient them a little bit higher to stabilize the rack system. In terms of which one's better than the other, I haven't necessarily seen anything there.
One of the pieces that I was going to mention regarding that question was simply that when you have a system with moving parts like a single axis tractor, you have added operation and maintenance. Now you're balancing that with the fact that you have higher production, right? And so because you have a moving part, that moving part is going to break down. And when you drive by the solar farm west of Lincoln, you're going to regularly see all the solar panels facing one direction, except for one rack is not facing all that direction. That one rack's got something going on, a sensor is bad or something. They'll eventually, probably within days, but they'll get out there and get that fixed. But that's added operation and maintenance costs. One of the questions that just came in was, have any owners brought up cellular interference issues? Have you heard anything about that, Eric?
I can't say that I have. Are they talking like radio, internet, radio, TV wave? Is that what the
I would say all the above.
Yeah,
I think they were thinking about cell phones, but I would say all the above.
No, I haven't seen anything specific to that in terms of a concern. I hate to speculate, but I mean, I haven't read, I don't have a study that I can kind of specifically cite, but I do know that these things are, used at, a lot of some airfields in terms of defense. And then also when you look at like airports that have them. So I haven't experienced anything there. No.
So there was another question about telecom systems. I haven't heard of any issues, and that doesn't mean that they don't exist, but I feel like that they've probably dealt with those mostly because I haven't really heard of that being an issue. One of the questions came in was, are these solar panels hail proof? And the answer is no, they're not hail proof, but they are tested with a golf ball size hail at 50 miles an hour hitting at a 90-degree angle. And they're supposed to survive that in testing. And so they are hail resistant. They actually, the National Renewable Energy Lab has a large solar array at their site in Golden, Colorado. They had a hailstorm come through last year, and it was a fairly significant hailstorm with some fairly significant size hail above that golf ball size, and they lost one solar panel. But some of that is that a larger hailstone hitting at a not 90-degree angle will not give as much force as hitting at a 90-degree angle. So they are hail resistant. They're pretty tough. Based on what I've seen, they're at least as tough, if not tougher, than my roof, my asphalt shingle roof. So and we lose roofs on a regular basis, but we also have insurance, and these companies would have insurance based on that as well.
I can say with full confidence that 159,200 panels north of town fared better than my wife's minivan during a hail event here. They're pretty resilient.
The last questions we'll get to. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I'm going to. There's one on opposition, but I think I'm going to let Peggy talk first before we try to tackle that one a little bit. But
I can stick around when we're done, John. So if you want to take Peggy's portion, and then we can stick around as long as I can stick around as long as you'd like for questions.
Okay.
So.
Peggy, why don't you start sharing, and then I'll answer this last question. The last question that I saw come up was as an update on the project east of Lincoln. I don't have a real informed update, but I will tell you this, that OPPD in the last winter, Omaha Public Power District put out a call for proposals for up to 600 megawatts of solar. And I think a number of solar projects have bid for that call for proposals. And I'm sure Ranger, which is the company that did that, is probably one of those. And if they sell that electricity, it's going to get built. Whether they sell it to OPPD or somebody else, that's what they're waiting for. And so what's the status of that? It's kind of in a holding pattern, waiting to sell that electricity. Will it get built? I think possibly it will. but I'm not sure. And I'm not privy to those conversations. I'm just speculating at the moment, but I feel like it has a decent chance of getting built. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Peggy Kirk Hall from The Ohio State University, and she's going to talk about contract issues.
All right, thanks, John. And thanks for I guess, virtually bringing us into Nebraska. Eric and I have talked about solar leasing all over Ohio, but it's nice to be out west and talk about it and see what's going on out there as well. And I don't think I told you, John, but I lived many years west of you in Wyoming. So I love the chance to get out west whenever I can, even if it's just virtually. So let's jump into some of the issues that I see as an attorney in regards to solar leasing. And as you're aware already, there's a lot to think about when we consider a utility scale solar lease, and all of the siting and practical issues, technical issues just raised by John and Eric. But I want to just now turn and focus a little bit more on the initial legal issues that you may face as you consider what effect this has on the community, on your family, on your land, and whether you want to make this decision to go into a utility scale solar lease. The landowners here in Ohio generally receive this kind of an initial contact from a company asking to see if they're interested in considering leasing. And so this is very common to have this kind of a postcard or letter received or left on the front door. Sometimes they'll come knocking and leave something like this, but they're starting to make that effort to see if you are interested, and even if your land is really well suited for their project that is under development. And so the question becomes, what do you do when you are contacted in this way? And as we all know, many of these contacts are going to farm landowners because they are looking for large parcels of land, and we have the land. And so how do we assess this opportunity? Is it an opportunity? Is it something we're interested in? And what are the legal ramifications of making such a decision? That's what I spend time thinking about, all of those issues. So Eric and John already showed you what it could look like, what you could end up hosting on your property if you enter into a solar lease. But before that, I think there are a lot of initial considerations to make that you then would want to parlay into a leasing situation if you decide to move forward. So I would encourage landowners to think about the impacts on the land as well as on the farm operation. We have seen both positive and potentially negative impacts on the operation, and the family is something to consider. Eric and I have kind of been caught up in the midst of some family consternation over whether to do this. So that's something to think about, as well as the neighbors in the community. And when we break that all down, I think we come up with a list of about 10 initial considerations that all feed into that before we should maybe even look at a lease. Let's just think about these initial considerations. So what's the length of this commitment? And you've seen that they can be upwards of 30, 40. We've added some up that could come out to about 55 years. That's a long-term commitment. And I think that's a consideration to make. We are now looking at possibly taking a generation or two off of the land. And that's a serious long-term commitment that warrants a close look. We'll also have to consider who else has legal interest in the land. Even as the landowner, we know that there can be many other legal interests on that land. Our mortgage would be a legal interest. So lenders have interests. Maybe we're renting some of the land to tenants. Maybe we are enrolled in government programs. There are all kinds of legal interests, mineral rights that may be held elsewhere. How are all of those legal interests going to align? Can they align? Can we even move forward with this type of a leasing situation with the various legal interests that may be on the land. Easements would be another one. And then we've talked a lot, I think Eric's recent pictures highlight the impacts on the land, the physical impacts of having an installation placed on the land, but also there would be consideration to be given to the impacts on the farm operation itself. Now, sometimes an entire farm could be under lease, but that's not usually the case. As we've seen, it's partly or a parcel of the farm or part of the farm that may go under lease. And so what impacts does that have to the remaining operation? Can we still access everything? What about our livestock? Is it going to affect the drainage, as Eric mentioned? What kinds of impacts will it have on the actual operation? And I can tell you that we see both positive and negative. I just talked with someone here in my area who is seriously considering a lease of part of their land and then using that influx of cash to build up their dairy operation. So sometimes we can see a very positive impact, but I think it's something to think through. And it's certainly a case-by-case analysis that needs to be done there when we look at those impacts. And I already mentioned some of the family problems that we've witnessed here in Ohio, and there doesn't seem to be any consistency at all on this issue. Sometimes it's the older generation who thinks they've found their retirement pot of gold and they're very excited about this, while the younger generation says, no, I don't want you to do this. I want to farm, I want to live here, I want to raise my children to live in a farming community, in a farming lifestyle. And this just throws that all out of the water. So we've seen it the other way too, where it's the younger generation very excited about this opportunity and the older generation very hesitant. So it's something that I think has to be addressed within the family, dealing with those family matters. And we could have other family issues like healthcare, retirement, long-term healthcare needs that all need to be taken into consideration as we consider the opportunity, the financial opportunity, as well as the loss of possibly a farming opportunity. Property taxes is something that we have to consider here in Ohio, and the effect that it will have on property taxes. Our differential tax assessment, I'll mention that later, but what effect will it have on as we convert that land to non-agricultural use? What kinds of penalties and increased taxes might we see? That's another consideration. And then I mentioned the government programs as one type of legal interest in the land. And so if you do have those government programs, there will need to be some negotiation there with the holders of whatever those interests might be. If you're in the CREP program or a wetlands easement program, something like that, we'll have to work with the government to renegotiate, determine what penalties there might be for withdrawal. All of those issues will have to be addressed as well. And then liability and insurance is one that we receive quite often a question about. So what does this mean for me? Is my insurance going to go up? Will I have a higher liability risk for hosting this? That's something that can be addressed within the lease, but it is something to consider, again, that there is that potentially increased risk. And then of course, the reaction of neighbors and the community. We are seeing a lot of conflict. It seems to be growing. As Eric and I have been working on this over the last few years, I would say that it seems to be that more conflict is brewing and more people are opposed to having a large scale utility operation in their community. And so that's something to think about, what effect it will have on your neighbors and the community. And then we also like to think about who you're dealing with. There's always due diligence necessary in a contractual situation. So who is this developer? What do you know about them? Or the several developers that might be in your area. Make that initial research effort to find out who you could be dealing with. We do have some landowners that are getting offers from several different companies. So finding out who you're dealing with can can be an important step in deciding whether you want to move forward into considering a lease. So with that, let's turn then and look at the lease itself and the leasing process. If you think this is something that you might want to consider, then it's good to take a close look at what might be in that lease. What kind of legal commitments would you have? And there are three primary parts that we often see in a solar leasing situation. I would say the last two here, the option and the lease, are definitely more common than a letter of intent. Don't see as many letters of intent as we do the actual option or lease. But on the right-hand side of the screen here, you'll see the kind of the skeletal outline of what's in that lease or what that solar leasing process looks like. And sometimes this is all one legal instrument. Sometimes we have separate instruments as the letters of intent and option and solar lease. But it goes through a life, basically, the leasing situation, where once it's effective, we move into an option period and a development period. Those are similar, different words used by different companies, but there we're in that phase of trying to decide if the project will move forward and if it will move forward on your land. And then if it is going to move forward, we'll enter into a construction phase. And then that operations phase, when it's up and running and producing energy, there might be a renewal phase where that lease is renewed for a certain period of time. And then finally, there will be a termination and then that cleanup and end of the project, the decommissioning that John and Eric mentioned, comes toward the end of that. So it's important to keep that in mind as you read through a lease, to understand that you're moving through these different phases and that there will be different provisions that address those different phases. So initially, if there is a letter of intent, it is that first effort in writing to try to reserve that property. The developer trying to get you to promise to hang on for a moment while we're getting this project together. It can be very informal, or it can be very formal and legally binding. And so it depends what's in that letter. And if they ask you to sign it, and if they give you anything, if it has some essential terms and they give you something, you might now be looking at a legally binding instrument rather than just a simple letter that's informing you that they're interested. So be aware of that. But as I said, we don't see as many of those as we see of the option and the lease approach that would come first to a landowner. Here's an example on the right, and I'll show you examples throughout the presentation here of actual language that we have pulled from leases that we've reviewed here in Ohio. And they're not just Ohio leases, they do come from other places, but all leases vary tremendously. I think because of the youthfulness of this development process, the leases are still undergoing a lot of change. In fact, I just reviewed one this morning that looks tremendously different than those that I reviewed a few years ago. So the leases are evolving, but we're going to show you some of the language just to familiarize you with what we are seeing in these leases, but recognize they don't all look the same, not nearly the same. Here's a confidentiality clause, and you might have something like this within a letter of intent saying that, okay, you're gonna reserve this right for us, and you agree not to solicit any other developers or negotiate or let anyone else try to deal with you or furnish information about a solar power entity on your land. So that kind of a confidentiality clause could come in early in this process when we're dealing with a letter of intent. And we might also see that in an option. And the option is going to be a more firm commitment between the two parties than a letter of intent would be. But in an option to lease, that landowner is giving that developer the right to develop the land for solar energy development if the developer, excuse me, I'm tripping over my tongue here, if the developer chooses to move forward and exercise the option. Now, the landowner doesn't have a choice. Once the landowner assigns an option, that's it. They're committed to move forward, but the developer at some point will decide, okay, we're going to back out of this and terminate this arrangement, or we're going to move forward, exercise the option, and go into the leasing phase. Now, this type of option is legally binding, unlike some of the letters of intent that we've seen, and it usually includes a payment. And there will be typically a lump sum payment for signing that option, as well as an annual rental payment that is made during that option period. And sometimes this is what is also called the development period, as I mentioned before. Now, don't assume, though, that an option is always a separate document. Sometimes the option, and I think this is far more common, is actually contained right within the lease. It's the beginning of the lease, basically, is the option. And so the two can be merged together, but just be aware as you review those documents, what they're trying to do. That's the important question, is what is this language doing, whether it's pulled out separately or it's combined, contained within the lease. It is giving them that option to proceed if it appears that the project is going to move forward. And you, as the landowner, will be paid for that, as I mentioned. So the length of that period can vary. And I think it's going to be dependent upon where the developer is in the project development, in the life of that project. How far along are they? They may need more time on some projects than on others. But here in Ohio, 2 to 5 years appears to be a common period for that option or that development phase. And so important to ask, okay, if I've made a commitment during this time, what can I do on the land during that time period? It's very common that there's an arrangement made that they can continue agricultural production. At first, those provisions weren't written into the lease. But now we are seeing those clearly written into the lease, that the landowner may continue to use the land for agricultural production. And then there will be provisions for what happens if we decide to exercise the option and move forward while there's a crop in the ground or the land is being grazed. We can address those damages that will need to be paid as we move from the option or development period into construction. So I've got some language here for you from a lease that shows an option term of 5 years, and the developer shall have the right to terminate the option. And there would be a payment made within 15 days of signing that option, and then annual acreage per acre payments made during that option period. Sorry, accidentally moved. So you can see that language down here. So moving then into the rest of that lease, as I said, the option might be the beginning of the lease, and then we have the rest of the lease, or they could be two separate documents, but this is the primary written legal agreement that you will deal with, the two parties will deal with. And as I said, it's typically presented in that lifetime approach, the lifetime of the lease. And you can see here, this is the most recent lease that we've been able to obtain here in Ohio. And it goes right into, as you'll see in a moment, developing those phases of the lease. So what we, excuse me as I move this, what we look to in that lease is, an identification of the parties. That's very common. The land, the property that will be affected by the lease. And then we get into those different lease periods, those different phases, and the payments for those different phases. There's compensation usually for other property type impacts that we'll find within the lease, and some other types of compensation. We will discuss those. Always there are provisions about the easements that you're granting as you grant this lease. Those easements, like the option, can be fully contained within that lease. So they may not look like easements. They may not be a separate legal instrument, but they're built within the lease. There are provisions typically on landowner obligations and rights and on property maintenance during that production period. And then we get to that decommissioning phase, termination and cleanup. And then there are always a number of general legal clauses. So I want to highlight some of these for you. I don't have time to go through everything that you might see in a lease, but what I'm going to present to you are those that we have seen most commonly in the leases that we've reviewed here. So let's start with looking at some of those lease periods that I mentioned before. And you can see here that this one is laid out pretty clearly in a development period and then an operating period. And then we have the potential of a renewal. So this is going to help us take a good look at what's going to be the potential life expectancy of this lease. And the development period here, this one's not filled in, but let's say it's a typical 5-year period during which they're trying to determine whether they will proceed and could be dealing with construction as well. And then in the operating term in this one, so it's laid out a little bit differently than what I described a moment ago, but we have the development period, then we go right into the operating term. And that, as you can see from my red boxes, 25-year operating term. That's when we are up and producing energy. And then we have a renewal provision in this lease with the right to renew for an additional 10-year period. That's one of the longer ones that I've seen. Usually it's a couple of years, 3 to 5 being, I think, pretty normal. I didn't see many with 10 years, but as I said, they all look different when we start taking a close look. So if we look at those different phases for the different periods of the lease, this one then lays out what those payments would be during those different periods or phases. And in this one, it says 5 years. It's a 5-year development phase. And during years 1 and 2, there'll be a $15 per acre payment. And then from 3 to 5, we go up to an annual payment of $25 per acre. And I was asking John earlier about numbers from Nebraska, we're just trying to understand whether they're similar as we go from Ohio to Nebraska. But the range that we've seen on that option or development period payment is about $15 to $40 per acre per year. And remember, that's typically when you're allowed to continue farming and using the land until they commence construction. So when we get to the operations period, you can see that this one has a 30-year operations period, and you can see some payments here as well. And we always hesitate to give numbers because sometimes numbers can't be shared due to those confidentiality clauses, but we think that we're looking somewhere in this range in Ohio, 700 to 1,200 per acre per year. And I think that's consistent, John, with you in Nebraska. This one is $850 per acre for the land inside the solar panel area. So inside the development, the energy production area, and then just a $35 per acre payment for land outside of the panel area. That would probably just be for access, minor amount of land there for that. And then note that there's usually some sort of an inflation adjustment factor included in these rental payments. And you can see that this one will adjust upward annually by 2.5%. And that is an important provision to examine as well when you're looking at payment. There could be payment for transmission access as well. And this would be, again, if we're looking outside of the facility area. You can see here that there are some payments, $2 per linear foot for roads or underground cables installed outside of that area. And then there are some additional provisions for different payments depending upon where they're installing these transmission needs that they may have. And that could be cables, underground cables, or roads that would host those. So be aware of that possibility. And you can see here too, lines and poles, those kinds of needs that they may have there's usually a linear foot payment for installing those. And then we could have some payment provisions that deal with crop damages, as I mentioned, and some of the early leases that we reviewed didn't include these at all. And I think that shows how the solar energy development world is coming along and starting to learn about agriculture and understanding that, oh, okay, there are certain needs on agricultural land that we need to address within these leases. And we're seeing that evolution occur in the leases. So some of them may not have these provisions and you may need to negotiate it into the lease. How are we going to deal with using the land during that development phase? Can we still farm it? And if so, how are we going to deal with the loss of the crop if you commence construction while the crop is still in the ground, or if you're still grazing livestock? How can we figure that out? Well, here's some language from some leases that show that there will be a crop damages provision paid on a per acre basis. And you can see over here some language on how we're going to calculate that amount. That's an important question. Just to say we'll do it is not enough, but let's get some detail on how we will determine the value of the lost crop. And there are a number of formulas floating around out there. I think it's important in this regard to have as detailed a formula as possible, as we have here on the right. We're going to look at the average yield in the county where that property is located, and we're going to use a price, and we can benchmark that price somehow, and then we're going to multiply that by this multiplier, which is really kind of a good faith effort to make sure that we're trying, that we're adequately dealing with the loss of that crop. So this one has a 1.1 multiplier to boost it up a little bit. Some kind of formula, at least some of those data points, I think, need to be in there to make sure that we're adequately compensating for that lost crop. Okay, some other compensation terms that we might see would be for drainage. Eric mentioned that we have a lot of drainage fears here in Ohio, that these installations will interfere with our subsurface drainage. And so that's something that we can account for in the lease. How will we deal with that potential? The fear I hear a lot from landowners is, well, once it's on, and then I learned it's interfered, what do we do about it? There's already 800 acres of solar panels there. How are we going to fix the drainage? So it's something that I think may need some preventive measures as well. And then looking at compensation if there is an unanticipated problem after we've taken those preventive measures to avoid interfering with drainage. And fencing would be the same way. There could be some fencing payments that need to be made for fences that have to be taken out, or perhaps they need to be moved, rebuilt, those kinds of issues. I already mentioned that possible penalty that a landowner in Ohio could incur from having the program pulled out of the agricultural, we call it CAUV here, it's our differential property tax assessment program. Because the land's being converted to non-agricultural use, there could be a penalty that that landowner has to pay. And then there could be those government program penalties that I mentioned. So provisions in there for that. And some of the leases, I think this one's interesting, have contained provisions that will pay for a landowner to obtain adequate expert assistance in reviewing the lease. And so they may pay your attorney fees, or they may pay for someone to come out and examine the potential impacts on drainage, or someone to help quantify what those crop damages might be. Some of the leases do have a provision that says we will compensate you for those expenses. So let's take a quick look. And John, feel free to interrupt me if there's a question that comes up about something on point. I don't mind being interrupted. I teach college students. I don't mind being interrupted at all. So
let's go to a question then quick. You going to easements is a good one for one of the questions. But earlier you mentioned both positive and negative impacts to a farm or land, and then you described some positive impacts. What are some examples of some of the negative impacts you've seen?
Well, so we haven't seen many yet because, we're still at the beginning of these actually going into place in Ohio. So I can anticipate some, and I think we could draw an analogy with the gas development that we've seen in Ohio and pipeline construction. The fear that as you saw with the laydown yards and the construction phase, the fear that we won't be able to bring that soil back to its production capacity, that would be one of the first negative impacts that I would be concerned about. Now, where it's under the solar, if it's within the solar facility area, we have to worry about that in 30 or 40 years as that's decommissioned. What can we do with that land? And I can tell you, we've heard from many lenders who are concerned about that. Is that land still going to be valuable or as valuable for agricultural production purposes? I think that's probably the biggest concern I would have about that potential negative impact on the farm itself. The other ones would be just if we are, placing this facility down in the midst of an active farming operation, what kind of changes are we going to have to make to the operation to accommodate that land use change? So are we going to need to reduce the number of livestock we're grazing? Are we going to, make equipment changes because we've now, lost 500 acres to solar development? I think we have to think through those changes too. And I think some of those could be negative. Is it going to be harder to do what we were doing before because of this development? So there's two.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. The next question is about easements, which you're getting into right now. So.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about those. Every one of these leases has some type of solar easement. It might be called various things like open access to sun, as you see here. But what you're doing when you grant this type of easement is you are promising that you will give them the exclusive right to sun on the solar area, the solar panel area, and you will not obstruct their ability to access the sun. You won't make improvements within or around that area that would interfere with that solar easement. So they have that exclusive right to basically harvest the sun in that area. So very common to see. And as you can see in this one, down in the bottom, that there's a restriction on new improvements generally. So and those improvements are not just buildings. We're talking about trees, any kinds of improvements that might interfere with the sun are going to be restricted, and you're not going to be allowed to make those improvements. But typically in the leases, they do allow existing improvements to remain in place. There's an access easement typically in one of these leases, and it is giving them the right to cross over the property in order to access the site. And it also could have, as you see here, the right to improve or build new roads for access purposes. So be aware of that. You may not catch that language, and then here they come building a new road and you're thinking, wow, I didn't know I granted that right, but it could be there within that access easement to improve or build. So there could be some impacts there on through that access easement. A transmission easement as well is found in these leases, and you can see here this is an exclusive easement for them to run those transmission parts and pieces that we talked about before, poles or lines or towers or cables. And as we like to do in the law, they throw all kinds of terms in there to make sure we've tried to cover all of those parts that may be necessary for transmission. There's, foundations, footings, towers, poles, cross arms, guy lines, all of those parts they could bring into this transmission easement and have the exclusive right to run those as necessary. Let's go then to
one of the things with the transmission easement that I just wanted to bring up is that the landowners that may not have solar on their property might get approached for a transmission easement. So the solar, your neighbor's got the solar, you're asked to sign a transmission easement to get that across your land. We're seeing that some. There are other ways to do it. They can go under right-of-ways and other things, but this has happened. I have talked to people about this. The other thing in Nebraska is the public utility can access eminent domain for this transmission to support the private solar development. That is part of the law, and so I don't necessarily expect that'll be common, but it is out there and it does exist. So
yeah, the hope would be wouldn't have to get to that point, right? But we've seen it with gas, where eminent domain has been used to extend those pipelines to bring our shale gas out. So it's not unreasonable to think that it could happen, I think, here and there in Nebraska as well. So that transmission easement is going to really be placed, from the panel area, the facility area, and in order to allow them to transmit that power off the property. Okay. And then we might have a nuisance easement. I have found a few of these in a few leases. And these are sneaky little provisions that basically say, we want you to just give us the right to commit a nuisance on your property. And in so doing, you're going to waive your right to challenge us for being a nuisance. And this is something that we've also thought about in relation to neighbors. Some of the developers have figured out that paying some type of a good neighbor payment to the neighbors and then asking them to waive their right to bring a claim based in nuisance is a good way to get neighbors on board with a project. But in this type of an easement, you're granting that right for them to have these solar energy production activities as well as construction activities and not be subject to a civil complaint from you for the nuisance impacts from those activities. Now, Eric and I have talked about, once it's up and running, is there much of a nuisance effect? And it appears that that's not where we would have the concerns. We would have the concerns all prior to, during the construction phase, all that activity. That's really when nuisance might be the biggest risk. But in the rest of the period, there's not going to be much noise coming. We know from some of the studies that reflective glare doesn't seem to be as the problem that many thought it might be. So this would address all of those, though. This type of an easement would deprive you of your right to complain at law for those impacts. And then, a good lawyer always drafts a catch-all phrase, and that's what this is, a catch-all easement that just says, you know what, we also want you to just give us the right to do whatever we need to do to make this thing happen, basically. And here's some language that says you're giving them an easement to undertake any such activities that they deem to be necessary, useful, and appropriate to accomplish the purposes set forth in this lease. So that can be a big one. And you might want to try to scale that back a little. A good attorney might have some language to propose to say necessary according to what? Is it commercially reasonable? Maybe we can have that kind of a standard within that type of easement. Okay, any other easement questions, John? All right, so let's look at some of the typical landowner obligations and rights provisions that we see, and then also a little bit on property maintenance terms that are in an easement. There are quite a few obligations often included in these easements that landowners will have, and so they clarify that property taxes will be a continuing obligation of the landowner, but then along with that, they will state that they would be responsible for personal property taxes. So I'm looking at real property taxes here. There's a right of non-interference or an obligation of non-interference that looks a lot like the solar access type easement, but we often see that that is reiterated later, that you will not interfere with the facility and that you are giving them exclusive rights. No other solar energy developer will be on the land, and they won't have to compete at all in order to install their facility. There's the obligation of quiet enjoyment that you're giving them, and then also clarification on what improvements are made. So sometimes we'll see these in an actual easement. Sometimes we'll see them in a separate provision that just lays out obligations. So be aware of that as you read through as to how they're presenting these obligations on the landowner. And then confidentiality clauses are very, very common in these leases. And you can see some examples there on the right side that highlight some of those obligations, that they can't construct or allow anyone else to construct a facility on that property, that they must maintain in the strictest confidence all information pertaining to the terms of the lease. And many of those extend even after the lease is over. You still can't share that information. You can't share information about the developer, how they produce energy, anything that you know. So no pictures, nothing that would perhaps reveal some of their methods or trade secrets or whatever it might be. Those are very typical obligations placed upon the landowner. And then as far as rights that we see, we often see that hunting and grazing rights are maintained in and around the property, but not on the facility itself. Although we are seeing a growth of interest in allowing sheep grazing within that production area. And that's something we were talking about before the meeting. There's a story just today about some sheep farmers to the east of us, clear out in, I think, New Jersey and Massachusetts, where they're finding out that this can work quite well. To instead of having the property maintained by mowers, they just allow sheep there, and they're now starting to place those panels high enough to avoid some of those potential conflicts. So those rights we would want to clarify within that lease, whether that could be a possibility. And then just access generally, we tend to see that the landowner would have access around the area, but not within the area. So that could all be laid out in the lease, just to clarify. One thing that we do find is often the fences, there might be locked gates and fences, and that could affect landowner access as well. So I mentioned the possibility of sheep, and Eric and I like to joke that, they kind of, cattle are out because they rub up against these panels and they can harm the panels. Goats want to climb on them, but the sheep seem to be okay. The sheep do well with solar facilities. And so there is increased interest in allowing the sheep to be the one maintaining the property. And in the story that I heard this morning, it was not the landowner who owned the land that the facility was on, but another landowner who brought her sheep onto this facility, and she was paid to actually let her sheep graze there and keep that property maintained. So some of those interesting little arrangements that we might see evolve as we get further into this. So there are provisions typically, though, about how we're going to control the vegetation on that project site. And I think, John, you mentioned the concern about weeds and noxious weeds, and who's responsible if there is a noxious weed outbreak on the property. In Ohio, Ohio law can clamp down pretty quickly on a property that's hosting noxious weeds. And so if that happens, we need the lease to clarify that would be, advancing the landowner's interest here. That would be the responsibility of the developer, since the developer has exclusive access inside that facility. So they need to make sure that they maintain that vegetation and deal with any potential noxious weed problems that would arise. And then also, how to maintain those access points where the transmission easements or other access points on the property that they may have rights to, who's responsible for maintaining those. And those, as you know, could involve roads and laneways, as well as maybe some, culverts, drainage culverts, those kinds of infrastructure. How are we going to maintain those? And then finally, we get to the issue of decommissioning, the termination of the lease, and the cleanup of the project. And usually that's the kind of language that we'll hear in a lease, is about cleanup and termination. So here's a provision where we're dealing with cleanup after the facility is constructed. And I think that's something that we don't often think about, that, okay, there's going to be cleanup when it's decommissioned and terminated, but what about after it's constructed? What about all those pictures Eric showed you of laydown yards and all those impacts from the construction itself? And you can see here that this lease has a provision that says that they will remove any construction debris and restore that property. And they use some good language here, legal language, to substantially the same condition as it was before they arrived. And so this raises the importance of documenting what the condition was before. So we need some benchmarking here to show what the property looked like before they began. And we want them to bring it back to substantially the same condition in places other than inside that, that solar facility area. So be aware of that provision and how important that can be. And this is one, John, that I think could have some soil impacts, some production impacts, compaction, those kinds of concerns. Let's think about how we are really going to bring this back to substantially the same condition when there have been, all this heavy equipment running through this area, or a gravel bed laid down. And now that's all going to go away, but can we farm that land after all those activities? Really important provisions there for that kind of cleanup and restoration. And then we have the provisions after the project. So now we're in the decommissioning phase. And you can see here that there's an agreement within this lease that says that they will remove the facilities at the end of the lease term. And this would also include an early termination. But look at this language. It's to a depth of 3 feet below grade. That's all they're going to remove. And Eric already mentioned how some of these things can be much deeper than 3 feet. And so this is concerning.
Peggy?
Yes.
So this this directly relates to one of the questions in the box. It says, will underground items such as conduit be removed during decommissioning? And so take in mind what Peggy has on the screen here, items to a depth of 3 feet. And I'm going to read just a couple of pieces here. So I have an application from a project that is roughly 1,400 acres of project area. So that's within panels. The total project area is 2,200 acres, and it's a 200 megawatt site. So their decommissioning plan states basically the same thing. It says that, removal of modules, tracking systems, posts, transformers, inverters, access roads, perimeter fencing, and cabling up to a depth of 36 inches below grade. Now, if you look at the application and you're looking at a description of the facility, it states underground segments of the AC collection system wiring will be buried at a minimum of 36 inches. So it's a long way of answering this gentleman's question, that their plans are to leave the conduit and the cable. Sorry for the interruption. I just thought it was timely.
Oh, no, I think that's perfect, Eric. And it's interesting that we're seeing that same number come up in different leases. So nothing will be above that 3 foot mark is what you're saying, right? But they will remove the nothing that's there.
Yeah, their plans are their plans are clearly to bury it at a minimum of 36 inches. So they know very well that they're going to leave it.
So I guess the important question for landowners would be, is that negotiable? Can you get them to agree to remove all of that cable and conduit? And I don't know the answer to that. I have not heard of anyone successfully negotiating that. Have either of you, John or Eric?
No,
No,
not to this point. And this also is true in wind power, where they're going to remove the foundation to a depth of a certain number of feet, essentially saying we're going to leave that giant foundation in the ground. And I've not successfully heard of anybody changing that. But I don't know. Sometimes you don't know what the details of the lease are because they can't tell you.
So I think this circles back to the question you raised earlier, John, about impacts on the farm. So if we're handing this off to the next generation and the project is being removed, yet there's, a lot beneath the surface, what impact does that have on their future opportunities with that land?
And
So be aware of those provisions, and I hope that there would be a way to deal with those a little bit better than this lease here does. You can see that this lease also gives them a year to do that, to remove the facility. And remember, the payment now is going to adjust downward once production has ended. There's going to be a different payment for this period, but you're giving them a year and an easement in order to do that. So we need to tie that back up to the payments to make sure that that's been addressed. There's a provision here as well in paragraph B about the fact that if the company doesn't remove it within that year period, and the facilities will be considered abandoned, and the owner would have the right to remove it. But the company will reimburse the owner for all reasonable costs. And so the concern here would be, is the company even still around at this point then? And that's where we need to think about the bonding. And I know you said, John, that that's required there. So that needs to be an adequate amount to deal with that potential of the landowner having to remove the project. There is the security provision right down here in C that you'll see as well. And this one starts in the 15th year that they're going to establish that security. And I think we would like to see that established much sooner. I think you said yours has to come in at year 10, John. Yeah, I personally, as an attorney, would want it there right away. But again, another point of negotiation that needs to occur as to when that bonding goes into place. All right, and with that, oh, sorry.
I was just, I guess, wanted to follow up. I don't know that, I think sometimes maybe it's easy for landowners to maybe underestimate the cost of removing this. When you talk about that, well, the facility is considered abandoned, and I hear people joke, oh, well, you go out there with the backhoe and you start ripping post up. But when you look at the decommissioning plans for some of these projects that have been submitted to our power siting board, I mean, here's one for a 200 megawatt project that's $8.9 million. I mean, they're looking at 100 and I think it was 154 full-time employees for a 12-month period to remove that. Here's another one that I'm looking at that's in the same range. I mean, it's you're looking at, like, it's not quite as big of a project, but it's a $6 million estimated removal cost. And so it's important for landowners, I think, to recognize these are big dollars we're talking about to remove these systems. And so making sure that you have that security bond or financing in place to have yourself covered is really important.
Well, and I wondered too, Eric, how the difficulty of predicting what those costs will be in 30 or 40 or so years as well. I think
right.
that's an additional challenge. And you can see in this lease, there's language here that will reimburse you for all reasonable costs of removing. And so what's reasonable? Are we going to have to argue about whether, if the landowner wanted to remove all the conduits and everything, was that reasonable? Or there could be, some legal battles that the next owner of the land may have to deal with that we need to think about here. Good. Anything else on that, you guys?
I think we're running a little short on time, so we should kind
All
of
right. Well, I'm on the last slide, so don't have a whole lot to say here about some of those general legal terms that come in just about any kind of contract. And attorneys are well versed with these, and they're not much different in the solar leasing context. The one that I would highlight, though, is the force majeure clause, because it is possible that a solar facility could go down during some type of a natural disaster, weather, something like that. And so we've seen provisions in there that suggest that if that happens, then the payment, if it's not actually producing, then the payment would go down during that period as well. And so we'd want to make sure that there's some incentive placed upon the developer to get it back online. Of course, they'll have their own economic incentives, but that's just something to be aware of, that you could see a reduction during those down times. And let's look at how they lay that out and what their responsibilities are. Otherwise, these are all pretty typical legal terms that I think we don't need to talk a whole lot about, John. So that gives me good reason to say I would highly recommend involving an attorney, and hopefully one who is familiar with agriculture as well as reviewing these solar leases. But there are some others to pull together in making this decision and reviewing this document if you decide to move forward. And so I just wanted to note that.